Hello, and welcome to On Point. I'm Martinez, and today we're here to talk about California's environment in relation to fire season. According to National Geographic, a wildfire moves at speeds of up to 14 miles per hour and consumes everything in its path. Recently, California had one of its largest and most destructive wildfires at more than 230,000 acres in Ventura and Santa Barbara counties. The Thomas Fire is now the fifth largest wildfire in modern California history. It was the largest in a series of wildfires that burned last December. Over 1,000 structures, including 780 homes, were lost. When a community is burned to the ground, neither an increase in shelters or a neighborhood full of friends can prepare people for the devastation that lies ahead. A CAL FIRE study reports more than 6,000 fires destroyed 500,000 acres in 2017. That's 43% more than in 2016, when about half as many acres were destroyed. The Proceedings of the National Academy of Science reports 84% of wildfires are started by human activity, whether through downed power lines, careless campfires, or arson. Climate change also plays a role in shaping detrimental California fires that occur more often. Temperatures are not as cold on average, and warmer temperatures tend to last longer throughout the year. This drier weather leads to more fuel for fires to burn, making it easier for them to start and spread. Most of California is still in a drought, and experts say an increase in heavy rainfall may not be enough to counteract the effects of rising temperatures, especially if they're accompanied by an increase in dry periods. So what constitutes wildfire season? And how have fires in California changed over the years? On Point's Angela Bickmann has more.
Thank you, Marissa. Today at On Point, we have three guests. Our first guest is Amalie Orme. She is a Geography and Environmental Studies professor here at CSUN. We also have Shea Broussard. He is a Geographic Information System computer mapper. And we also have Tony Shafer. He is a spatial data analyst for fire behavior modeling. So I'm going to go ahead and get into our first question. Is there such thing as fire season in California anymore? You can start.
Well, we used to think there was a fire season, and in our traditional way of thinking, probably from mid-20th century and into the early years of this century, we always thought it was going to be sometime in the fall and into maybe early winter. But I think within the last 2 decades now, we've seen a very different type of pattern where we can see fire year-round.
And Shea?
Start looking at the data, definitely is skewed more towards like she said, a year-round pattern that we're seeing. A lot of times those patterns are a lot more frequent. They used to be every 20 years. Now they're starting to become more and more frequent and a lot more pervasive throughout the landscape. So,
Do you have anything to add?
I would agree with that, except that recently I've been looking at the fire data and trying to divide it into large, extensive fires and then sort of normal. And I'm dividing it arbitrarily at 1,000 acres. And the fires under 1,000 acres are sort of, they're sort of been the same for the last maybe 20, 30, 40 years. It's been, and they're kind of actually trending down. But the larger fires, they're getting larger and they're getting more frequent.
Right.
And I think what we saw last season with the Thomas and then the Tubbs fire and everything is sort of an example of what we're going to see in the future.
So is it fire season determined by weather, like heat and strong winds?
Well, those are partial factors into fire season, and we're all aware that when you have reduced humidities and you have winds that are accelerating as they come over the mountains into Southern California, certainly, and also in the area to the north of San Francisco. But there's other factors as well, which are often out of our control and which may be more related to the way the urban environment is constructed.
Yeah, given a majority of the fires that we see, I think are typically found or adjacent to a roadway. So you're seeing a lot of things as human interacting with the landscape is, increasing not necessarily the amount of fires, but the particular location of the fires are either, off roadways near or the urban interface is what they call it. So they're closer to structures and properties that are now being affected that maybe in the past when there didn't used to be structures or property there, but now there are. So there's a kind of segues in that, but I'll let Tony speak to the rest.
Well, my view is just a little different, nuanced, I guess, is that I think we have to make a distinction to when we have a fire on the landscape as opposed to fire within structures. When you have one or two houses that are burned on a wildland fire, that's one type of fire. But when you have whole communities burned that start from a wildland fire, that's a completely different fire. And the reasons for that are totally different than the other. One is the normal thing that we've been dealing with for the last 50 or 100 years. The other one is more infrastructure failures of the fire service, fires of problems with mitigation or the lack of effort on mitigation. Mm-hmm. Some of it has to do with the perception of the environmental community on what they're trying to protect. And all of these things are sort of, matching together and in the long term, making fires bigger, more dangerous, and losing, greater value.
So are most of these large wildfires, are they started by humans and then like things like heat and strong winds and like the soil kind of makes them grow? Well,
all of these fires are driven by all these natural things, everything that you mentioned. But the real thing that I personally think that really adds to it is the buildup over years of fuels and the tons per acre of dry fuels on the landscape, and the fact that we haven't figured out how to get rid of that or to decrease that.
And you hear a lot of people referring to this as the Smokey the Bear phenomenon, and it's kind of our fuel management practices over the last 100 years was Smokey the Bear. Only you can prevent forest fires, so every time there was a forest fire, they immediately put it out. So everything was put out. So therefore, like Tony says, you get this accumulation of more and more and more. So more people putting out fire, there's less grazing on the landscape, so there's more and more fuel being built up, and then so when we do have these fires, they obviously have a lot more fuel to fuel them.
And when you look at the data, of fires under 1,000 acres, the size of those fires has steadily gone down for 20 years. We're right on top of them, we're eliminating them, we're decreasing the size of those fires, and every one of those fires potentially make the fires over 1,000 acres larger every time you shorten that.
Well, you have another dynamic in here when you have this big fuel loading, especially in areas that are very difficult to access. Because when you start to then look at the way fires are patterned over time, like what you're saying in terms of acreage, but also the temporal component, we wind up with these mosaics of vegetation which may not have the adaptive capacity to regenerate and prevent the understory from basically refueling itself.
Absolutely, and I think actually is that as human activity has changed over the last 100 years, particularly because I think that's what we're most of it. Just the change in human activity, the going from a subsistence farming lifestyle to a wage-based economy has changed everything. And I personally think that that's within Southern California, that's the driver. It's this distance where at one time in 1900 it was 40 acres and a mule and probably a cow and maybe a few head of sheep, to now the guy's driving to Lockheed and working there, and that 40 acres is split up into 40 different little houses.
Speaking how things have changed, climate change deniers say that fires are a natural process and nature needs them. What is your opinion on this?
I don't think any of us would disagree that fires are a natural phenomenon. And the fact that we have people in an increasing population that is expanding into areas that would burn, it is already there on the landscape. So It's not a matter if you are accepting or denying climate change. It is on the landscape.
Yeah, it is on the landscape, but the interesting thing is that I've gone back and looked at homestead records in California anyway, from about the 1860s. The Homestead Act, I guess, 1865, something like that. So if you look at the homestead patents in 1900, all these areas that we think of as the interface that people have moved into, they were homestead patents in 1900. And people were living on that land. The difference is they were growing wheat, they were raising cattle, they had all kinds of farming environments going on, and we've changed all that. We've changed all that totally. And so now all we have is fuel buildup until we have fires. And I think we've always been there. If you look at a map of the state of California in 1850, you'll see all the good land was taken by the ranchos. The only thing left were all those inter areas, and you look in the Santa Monica Mountains in particularly, that's where all the homesteads were, right in the areas where we have the problems today. And they've been there for
So the big misconception on
100
that.
years.
Yeah.
But it's just that legacy of policies that were made 150 years ago that we have no control over, and that's sort of leading us into where we are today.
Yeah, and getting back to the question, like, at the end of the day, if you look at the type of fauna and species that are categorized as pyrophytes, and what that means is the only way that their seeds actually regenerate is for that to burn. So without fire, then they can't regenerate and you can't regrow. So at the end of the day, it's definitely vital for the ecosystems.
Right. Okay, so Amalie, this question is particularly for you.
Okay.
How does climate change and the environment contribute to natural disasters like fires?
Well, when we look at climate change, if we're speaking just about California as opposed to global considerations or even the Northern Hemisphere, when we look, for example, at temperature records in California, we can see a steady rise of both average and minimum temperatures from basically mid-20th century, but especially since the early 1980s. And while we had kind of touched on this earlier, what we're really looking at are the anomalies with the minimum temperatures. And when you start to perturb minimum temperatures from month to month, then you start to look at changing ecosystems. You change looking at adaptive environments and adaptive capacities on the landscape. So there is little doubt about the trend of where minimum temperatures are going. But of course, that means if we're going to have, say, shorter winters or longer summers, then of course you start to increase the ability to have more fires.
Right. So how do the after effects of fires damage the environment?
Well, if we're talking about hazards, hazards become hazards when there are people there. Because things like what we saw in Montecito in January of this year, with the massive debris flows following the Thomas fire. And basically this was propagated by, it was over an inch of rain within a very few minutes. And you basically have a barren landscape with very little to hold back the debris. But it becomes a hazard because you have people involved. But we have enough records from the last 7,000 years in that area that there were debris flows on the landscape that followed fire when you had a very large rainfall event.
Okay, so Shea, can you tell us your experience as a victim of a wildfire at a young age?
Sure. So when I was about 8 years old, my family lost our house to the 1993 Old Topanga fire. And I've had a chance to talk about this with a lot of other members in the community and other people that lost their houses as well. And I didn't really understand how to process the feelings and emotions at the time. Like it was very, very, very strange, very odd. But looking back on it, that's why I know how to explain it, is like, you just have like a really, really bad day. Like so something happened to work or this and that, you just want to go home and just go lay in your bed and go to bed and just sleep it off and wake up the next morning. So when you lose your house, like, what you don't realize is you lose that sense of place, that sense of home. Like you've had the worst day that's ever happened to you, and you don't have a place to go home to. You look at your family. Like the first time I ever seen my dad cry, I was a young little boy. Then my dad was my tough guy. The first time I seen him cry, that was just like, what is happening? Like I don't understand. So it was a lot of emotion, but at the end of the day, what was really interesting, the community was never the same. Like, I lost my house in the same fire, he saved his house, but we both have very interesting and very similar experiences with the community. The community was never the same again. A lot of people moved out and they left. My best friend growing up, they didn't have insurance, so they lost it. When we had the fire, our insurance company went bankrupt. So we didn't really get the full payout that we should have gotten from our insurance company that we were actually insured for. So there was a lot of dynamics that so many things happened, and rebuilding and this and that. And we rebuilt the house. We couldn't even move back into it because it was a new house and the taxes were too expensive for us to afford. So we then had to rent it out. So it was it's this perpetual disruptive event that it's not just as disruptive. Okay, the Thomas Fire happened, these people lost their houses, or the Thomas Fire happened, these thousands of people lost their houses. It takes years to try to recover, and it's a lot bigger event than I think people actually wrap their brain around.
Where did you go to live after that happened?
Luckily for us, we had an investment house that we bought that they were going to work on fixing up, so we had some place to go to, but friends were really helpful. So we were fortunate, but some of our friends and family, and members of the community, were not. Some of the community members that, when the fire came through, actually perished in the fire, so they had no one. So yeah, like I said, we were lucky, and we're lucky the most. But
were you able to save anything from the house?
Albums. That's
right.
You have your to-go box. That's about it.
Most important thing. So my next question is for everyone.
See, I'd like to comment just a little bit on that, because I think one of the impacts that people really don't recognize is that when you have one of these events, and the '93 fire was in the community that I live in, out of 500 homes, we lost maybe 350, something like that, and most of those were along Pacific Coast Highway. It was a community of school teachers, firemen, policemen, lifeguards, a lot of retired people. When the fire came, those people are all gone. Of those people, I'm probably one of the only. I was a firefighter for Los Angeles City at the time. I'm probably the only one that's still there. I think there's one lifeguard that's still there, but all the rest are gone. So it changed from a middle-class community to a very high-value community, and it virtually happened overnight. And I'll lay money the same thing is going to happen in Ventura, and definitely the same thing is going to happen in Santa Rosa. When you go back and look at the demographics, it's going to be totally different. So they're going to be a totally different community, and it's going to be devastating to those people.
So with all these mass evacuations happening more often, do you know if there's an increase in shelters? Or do you think there needs to be? Increase in shelters.
There's probably more than enough shelters around. The problem is that people are not really prepared to be sheltered. They don't have their to-go bags. They don't have all their financial information. All their insurance documentation. Their computer hard drives backed up. They don't have all. That's where the devastation is the fact that they get to these places and they're sitting there on this bench, and they realize the only thing they've got in the world is what they're sitting there with. And that's where the real problem is. That's the real problem. People just are not prepared for this event.
So Tony and Shea, can you explain your Flame Mapper website to us?
I'll let him explain the website. He's the webmaster.
So Tony and I met here at CSUN in graduate school, and we came up with a computer wildfire simulation mapping program called Flame Mapper. And basically what it is we take very sophisticated wildfire simulation models that are currently used by U.S. Forest Service, and we found out really clever ways to multi-thread them and make them, instead of being like a post-fire analysis tool, make them a real-time fire analysis tool. So instead of taking 8 to 10 hours to run a simulation, we can run it in 5 to 6 seconds. So we use big computers with very clever processing and programming to be able to run in real time. So pulls in wind, fuel, topography, slope, canopy, bolt base, density, height. So all that fire science information that you can pull in and feeds into the model, and we can kind of predict where it's going. Granted, it's still a model, and you're never going to 100% accuracy, but what we've been seeing with some of the, with the Tubbs Fire up north and with the Thomas Fire is they can be pretty accurate sometimes, and definitely very insightful. especially when we start getting really in deep in some of the technology that we have. Is now we're at a point now we're not just modeling where the fire's going, we're actually created a very sophisticated algorithm, or Tony created a very sophisticated algorithm that basically identifies where the natural level landscape features are, so that actually promote fire containment. So an obvious one that we all know is like sheer rocks or a lake. Obviously the fire's not going to burn through those. The rest of them are kind of invisible to the naked eye. You can't really see them. They're like a certain configuration of like a hyperion area or a certain types of species of plants that when grouped together promote fire containment. But like I said, you can't see them. So the idea is using those algorithms to identify where those are. And we've done this by studying thousands and thousands of fires in the history and understanding where these fires stopped and where they were naturally contained. Because like I said earlier, there's a reason why when a fire starts, the entire planet doesn't burn to the ground, because nature has these natural level landscape features built into it. So what we're trying to do is not just predict where it's going, but learn how to understand the landscape in a lot more in-depth way, so we understand where we can kind of use some of those natural level features to help us promote fire containment. So when we put suppression on top of that, we can actually have more of a fighting chance to control these fires.
And I think my effort, is mostly directed towards fire mitigation as opposed to suppression, and I think it's more cost effective, if you will, to do these things years in advance. The problem is that it may take 5, 10, 15 years to put things in place, and to manipulate the landscape in such a way that you have a good mitigation. I mean, the landscape is going to burn. You're not going to stop that from happening, but you can slow it down enough where you can get people in place in order to save structures and lives, and that's really what the important thing is, from my perspective anyway.
Can you tell us more about your job with the LA Fire Department?
My job with it, I was a firefighter for 40 plus years with LA City. When I was first hired, this is going to date me, but I was hired the year after the Bel Air fire, and they needed thousands of donkeys to be out there on the hillside. This is before helicopters, and so I was a grunt and traveled these hills and carried hose and did wildland firefighting with LAC. Helicopters came in and that took that job away. So now, I spent most of my time as a structure firefighter, central Los Angeles, downtown, south LA. So I've been a structure firefighter mostly. The '93 fire sort of was a wake-up call to me that I better get involved here, and then I've been since '93. Since that fire, I've been seriously involved in wildland fire, both from modeling and promoting my various methods of mitigation.
Can you tell us maybe a story about one of the times that you were battling a fire?
Well, probably the best story is the '93 fire, because I was on site in the La Costa community, and when the fire was coming down, and I remember I had gone. A friend of mine, Don Wallace, who was a firefighter, he called me to his house about 10 o'clock in the morning when the fire started, and I helped him prepare his house for the fire to come. He was on Coal Canyon and Mulholland. So I prepared his house, and before I got to leave and everything, people had taken antiques and things and put them, God, it brings tears to my eyes to even think about this, brought these antiques and put them in my truck, and I took them back to Malibu, put them in my garage. 5 hours later, the whole street was on fire, and we were battling for our lives on that street. And I always remember that I had an apartment house across the street from me that had gone down, and 3 apartment houses next to mine were on fire. And I had 2 companies from San Luis Obispo that were working for me at my place. And as the apartment house next door to me started to fall, it fell towards my building and banged against a eucalyptus tree. I always remember it. I can still see it. And it pulled the top 2 floors off out of the building, and the building went back and the wall stayed, and there was a baby grand piano on that floor, and then it just all collapsed into a heap. And we were there for the next 15 hours trying to keep that heap of flames and fire from burning down my house. And we probably saved, I don't know, 10 houses.
I really respect what you guys do out there.
Listen, you're a creature of your environment. You're there, you know what to do, and you do whatever. But it brought home to me that you need to have that infrastructure in place. If that company from San Luis Obispo hadn't been there, and there hadn't been water supply in my neighborhood where I lived, the entire neighborhood, my house, everybody would have been gone. But we had some water, and we were able to save probably 10 structures. But you've got to have that infrastructure.
And that's what wasn't there in the Thomas Fire.
And that's wasn't there in the Thomas Fire, nor the tubs, for that matter.
They lost water.
And I personally think that you're gonna have cities the size of Burbank and the cities the size of Glendale burn.
Unfortunately, we have to move to our last question. But how do you think California residents can make a difference in preventing these fires from occurring so often?
Well, we can't actually prevent the occurrence of fires in terms of their numbers or their outbreak, but we can be better prepared. You know, and the straightforward things, of course, is brush clearance, but it's also too being able to work with an adaptive environment and recognize that as climate gets a little bit warmer, that we're going to be looking at different species that are going to be fire followers, or that we as people can introduce species that are more fire tolerant.
My work is, for the last 10 years, I've done nothing but in the fall is collect acorns. Yeah. And every year at the facility there in Malibu Canyon,
Los Angeles County Fire,
we grow probably anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 oak trees. And oak trees, especially coastal oaks are probably the best fire protection you can ever have.
To reduce fire intensity.
And we're looking to be able to plant more of those in order to mitigate the spread.
Okay, all right, that's all we have time for today, but I want to thank my 3 guests for joining us and the viewers for watching.
So I've come up with the family emergency plan.
Great. What is it?
It's difficult to talk about, so I'm not telling you.
How will we know what to do?
You won't.
I'm so glad I won't have to remember anything.
And me too. Thanks for this, sweetie.
Talk to your kids about who to call, where to meet, what to pack. Visit ready.gov/kids for tips and information.
Thank you for watching On Point. You can follow us on social media at CSUN On Point. You can hear us on KCSN 88.5 FM on Sunday mornings at 5:30. You can watch us on Santa Clarita Valley Television on Sunday evenings at 5 and on LA 36 at 9:30 Thursday nights. For all of us here at On Point, I'm Marissa Martinez.